Over the past few months, there's been a lot of conversations talking about the state of Honkai Star Rail right now, why players are dissatisfied with certain things, why people are quitting the game, and there's just been a lot of discussion about what needs to be done to make Honkai Star Rail better and to fix the issues of the game. And I honestly haven't really talked about this that much. I tend to keep my content a lot more like informative and whatnot as to like what's happening with the game, but I think it's finally time to break that silence. So today, I want to give my thoughts on a lot of the major conversations and topics that have been floating around the community over the past few months, and just giving my thoughts on them, because honestly, in my opinion, just to keep it, a simple kind of thing to lead us in, I think that there are things about Star Rail that are still good, but there are definitely things that need to be addressed and things that do need to be fixed. And I think that these things can happen, but I think it's so important that we actually do address these things and bring up our concerns for these things. So this video is pretty much just going to be me talking about all these things. So if you want to put me in the background while you do your dailies or whatever gacha game you're playing, or just playing whatever other game, that's all good with me, because it's just going to be a talking kind of video here with some gameplay in the background. So the first of the topics that I want to talk about today is the story and storytelling. And I do just want to give a disclaimer. This is going to have some spoilers for the Amphoria story, so if you do want to avoid those, I do have timestamps for each of the 4 topics, so be sure to just go past this story one, because I will talk about certain things that happen in the Amphoria stories. So when it comes to the storytelling conversation, as I'm sure if you keep up with the community or have kept up with the community, we all know that this topic started with the very infamous video from Ryuku Sensei. And at the time of that video coming out, I wasn't really too invested in this kind of conversation, because that was back before I got back to live streaming. And when I play through stories on my own, I do end up playing through them at a faster cadence. So I wasn't really feeling any of the, or as many of the critiques that a lot of people were having about the story. But now that I have played the past couple Star Rail stories on stream, playing it much slower and in the way that I think a lot more people do tend to enjoy the story, I definitely have noticed issues with it. And while the writing of the story is very good, there are some problems. And there's 2 main ones that really got to me, which if you had other issues with the story, definitely let me know in the comments down below. That goes for both this section and any section of this video as well. I'd love to hear what other people are thinking. So I think the first of the 2 things is that the storytelling and how engaged I am into the story is lacking at times, despite how good the writing is, because the writing for it is pretty good when I am paying attention and taking in the story, seeing the important stuff in the dialogue. It is generally good. And there have been some minor improvements between 3.0 and 3.1, which is very good, but a lot of the time it feels like there's too much just dialogue and lore dumps, even still with the improvements they made between 3.0 and 3.1, and not enough time of me actually playing the game in a meaningful way. And the reason I say a meaningful way is because one of my biggest gripes with the 3.0 Amphoria story is the fact that while we did have probably more gameplay time in that compared to 3.1, there were a lot of puzzles that just felt redundant and unnecessary. So I think that these stories, while there are some really good parts in them, I do think that improving the storytelling by having more cutscenes, not having as many fade to black screen moments, those will definitely make the story more engaging. And then also having more things for me to do as a player during the story, not necessarily for them to be difficult things, because I don't think the story should be difficult by any means for any player, but just having more for me to do than just occasionally walking somewhere and then being put into 10 minutes of dialogue. Because at least for me, sure, some people love the story, which is great, and are mainly story players. It might be a thing that people can disagree with, but that's fine. I tend to prefer the actual combat of the game, which is the main reason I started playing Star Rail day one in the first place. So while we don't need to have fight after fight after fight in the story, it would be nice to have more meaningful interactive things during the story, as opposed to just having a bunch of dialogue, although the dialogue is still very good. So I think just adjusting the ratio of those is going to be really good for the game. But then my second gripe with the story and storytelling, which honestly was something I realized more so after 3.1, is that while the length of the story quest has been a pretty big topic ever since that Ryuku Sensei video, I do think that, especially with 3.0 and 3.1 so far, the story length could have been shortened a decent amount without, messing up the quality of the story. And we've even seen shorter stories do well in Hoyoverse games already. Like Zenless Zone Zero stories are all relatively short in comparison to Star Rail. And Star Rail also had a shorter story quest in 2.7, which I think was a very good length in comparison to some of the other quests we've gotten. So things like that have already been tried by Hoyoverse, and they have already worked. And in both the 3.0 and 3.1 story, each of those has a section that is around an hour long, maybe slightly more, that I think that while these sections were good, one of them being better than the other one in my opinion, I think they could have been split into a companion quest instead for certain characters, which is a whole nother issue in itself because Hoyoverse hasn't done companion quests in a pretty long time, and I think they're really good for giving us more interactions with characters without overly bloating the main story. So for version 3.0, the section of that story that falls into this category is the section with the Herda right before we get to the end of the 3.0 story. While I think that section is probably going to be important lore-wise as we get further down into Amphorius, I feel like its placement felt a little bit out of place just based on the fact that the whole story was about everything with Strife and us dealing with the Titan. And then as we, finish the battle with that, but we know that what's coming next with us going to the Vortex of Genesis for Finon's trial, we randomly go into this random side quest with the Herda, which kind of just felt out of place for that. I feel like by taking that hour and a half and moving that over to a companion quest instead would have actually been a lot better, because while it's not super important, I think, for the plot right now, I think having that background of the Herda will be important for later, thus, also taking an hour at least out of the main story, making it not feel as bloated, which I think is really good. But then the other one, which I think is the one that really, got to me, was in version 3.1, because despite, I think, the story overall being better in version 3.1, I think that the Tribios backstory at the end, while it was really good, it could have also been a companion quest for Tribi. Now, the main reason I say this is because I think narratively, and just the way I saw the story, ending for 3.1, it kind of just felt like they shoved the story at the end of the quest instead of thinking about a better placement for it. And the big reason I say that is because of what happens right before you get into the Tribios backstory. And for 3.1, right before the Tribios backstory is where you get Maide finally, clearing the trial. You get him, helping you defeat the Flame Reaver, and then he ends up going back to Castum Kremnos to be the new ruler there and to make the change that he wants to make in his homeland. And I think that him finally going home and sitting on his throne was the perfect spot to end the quest. But instead of them ending the quest there, they went into a whole hour and a half story about Tribios, which was good. I want to keep saying that because I don't want people trying to twist my words. But I think that having that quest just separately, having the Tribios part separately from the main story, I think would have been really good, rather than sort of lumping it in at the very end of the quest there. And I think through both of these examples, I think being able to take the quests or take these parts of quests and make them into separate companion quests or separate not quite main story quests but smaller but still well contained stories, I think could be very good for the game, to not bloat the player with this super long story experience every time they want to do the main story, instead of having smaller chunks that they can consume at their convenience, whether it be if they do it all in one day, if they spread it out where they do the main story and then a few days later they do the side quest. That'll give them more lore and more context to the story. But overall, I think that when it comes to the story, they are on the path of making improvements, and they did listen to some of the feedback we had for 3.0. So I can only hope that as we keep giving them more feedback, they're going to make the story better for the remainder of Amphorius, and I really hope they do because of how long the Amphorius stuff is going to be. Next up, I want to talk about the power creep and HP inflation situation, because this has probably been the biggest topic in the community for several patches now, honestly. And I'm sure we can all agree that power creep, just as a concept, is going to exist in every gacha game. It doesn't matter if it's Honkai Star Rail, it doesn't matter if it's Wuthering Waves, it doesn't matter if it's even Dragon Ball Z Dokkan Battle. Any game that is a gacha, there's going to be power creep because the companies want to make money on every new character. And when it comes to Honkai Star Rail's power creep, it definitely exists, and it definitely has gotten harder for players over time. And the HP inflation stuff, it definitely is real. And it has resulted in multiple characters pretty much, I wouldn't say are like completely unrunnable for the most part, but they definitely are a lot less valuable to use just because there are other characters that are going to be able to perform better, and sometimes even with less investment or less risk. Now, I think that the biggest thing for Honkai Star Rail to do is that they need to focus less on artificially increasing difficulty by just, oh, I'm going to increase the HP of this stage, or oh, I'm going to increase the defense of the stage. I think they need to make more interesting strategic, mechanics for these fights to not only, make them seem like they're harder, but also make us work around these mechanics and actually take advantage of the fact that it is a turn-based, strategy game, and actually have some kind of strategy in it. Because right now it's pretty much just like get the best teams and then you can just get through all the content, when the way this game is set up, it has so much potential to be a game where you can actually have strategy and just thinking about all of the moves that you're going to be making, and really just focusing on, okay, this enemy has this mechanic, so I'm going to, do this kind of setup, which may not be the optimal setup in most situations, but it's going to work extremely well here. I think that that kind of thing would be really good for Honkai Star Rail. Now, when it comes to the power creep itself, I think in my situation, and one of the reasons I took a while to actually speak on it on the channel, is because, at least for me, it took longer for me to actually feel the influence of power creep and actually start struggling a little bit. It took me a lot longer to feel that in comparison to other people, and I think the main reason for that is not because I'm a whale or anything, because I'm not, but it's because my account has been around since day one, and I pretty much haven't taken a break from Honkai Star Rail ever since release, as we're going on almost 2 years now. So in comparison to people who didn't start when I did, or have taken breaks and just haven't had as much time on their account, starting and not having as many resources available to you in comparison to someone who's been playing since day one can also be a pretty big, deterrent for people when they don't have the characters that are going to be able to clear the endgame content. And I do think that while making, good decisions can help someone, to not feel power creep, but I do think eventually, despite all the good decisions you make, you may still hit a wall as long, if you are a low spender or even free to play. Obviously, whales will just get every character and be good, but for someone who's not getting every character, which I think are the majority of players, you can definitely hit a wall at a point and feel honestly really helpless because you're not able to clear all this content anymore, and you're losing, while it's not that many, rewards, you are still losing out on stuff on your account as, your account further gets power crept, and the only way you can deal with that is by either spending money or just getting the new characters if you're able to save up for them. So while it's not while power creep isn't necessarily a 100% bad thing, it is affecting people pretty harshly in Honkai Star Rail here. Now, it's not I don't think it's a game-ending, catastrophe kind of thing, but I feel like if Star Rail changes the way that they handle creating their endgame, which I'm going to talk about in my third overall point for the video, I think that there can be some really good changes that they can make that will make power creep a bit less like constricting for people and just overall lead to a better player experience. Now, I do want to bring up the fact that they did already confirm that they are going to be buffing older characters, which is a pretty big sign of hope. But I think that the success of that completely rides on the way they implement it. Because if they do a good implementation of actually buffing these characters like Sela, Kafka, Jingliu, characters that are not great to run right now, if you buff them to be able to stand, maybe not, they don't have to be above the new characters because obviously the company wants to make money, but if they can be either like at a similar level or very like slightly below, so it's not as big of a gap anymore and they can compete in current endgame content, that is going to be the best case scenario, and it's going to allow units to, be relevant for longer and just overall be a healthier game space for players and is going to want players to keep coming back. But if they don't implement this well, if they just do simple things like increasing stats, which makes them increase the stats of the endgame even more, then we're just going to fall into the same cycle and it's not even going to be worth it for them buffing the older characters. So we'll see what happens. But I do think that while power creep is rough for a good amount of people right now, I don't think it's like this massive game ending kind of problem right now. But if Hoyoverse keeps this kind of trash model they have for all of their endgame stuff and just the way they're handling power creep in general, I think we can get to that point, but we're not there right now. So now for my third topic here, which is very related to the power creep topic that we just talked about, is Honkai Star Rail's endgame in general. And I think I want to keep this separate because I feel like the structure of the way Honkai Star Rail handles endgame is important enough by itself to talk about. And in my opinion, I think Honkai Star Rail's endgame model, it kind of sucks. And the reason for that is while rotating endgame modes are cool, they really only give a small burst of content to players that have done everything else in the game. So it's like every 2 weeks we get a new endgame, whether it's Memory of Chaos, Pure Fiction, or Apocalyptic Shadow. And what most people end up doing, they'll get through other stages, and then outside of just building characters, we have not only nothing else to do, but nothing else to use those characters in that is new and engaging. And while I feel like when it comes to, game modes like that, it's not for every kind of player because there are going to be casual players. There are going to be players who are not really worried about like, oh, I want to push my account to its limits and stuff like that. But for the people that do, it never hurts to have a mode that they can do that in. And right now in Honkai Star Rail, the only permanent endgame modes are the original Forgotten Hall stages, which, let's be real, in 2 years into the game, those stages are absolutely nothing difficulty-wise. And then Simulated Universe, which I kind of just, make its own thing. Well, Simulated and Divergent Universe together, it's kind of like its own separate thing. I wouldn't really call it endgame in a sense, but it is more strategic, which is nice. I do think that having something permanent that maybe doesn't have insane rewards, but still has something that's permanently available for players who want a more challenging experience to challenge themselves would be a very good thing for the game. And actually, I want to bring up Zenless Zone Zero again because they have actually implemented a permanent game mode that has done very well. They released the Endless Battle Tower a couple patches ago, and then they released an update for it in the most recent patch. So there are 2 different permanently available towers that you can also grind endlessly, which is great for players who want to see how strong that not only their characters are, but also how good they are as a player, since it is a more like skill-based game. And I do think that they also do very well in making a lot of the rewards very accessible. They keep them in the first several stages so that if you're not looking for a challenge, you can kind of swoop in and get the rewards and be done. But if you want more of a challenge, you can go even further beyond there, which is, I think, would be a very nice thing for Honkai Star Rail. Now, how they'll implement it, I'm not sure. But I think having some kind of endless mode in there where players can actually test their account and really just test their limits of how good their characters are and how good of strategy they have for Honkai Star Rail, I think would be very good to not only give some players that thrill, but also have a place of permanent content that goes beyond just oh, I'm gonna build this character today and not know what to use them for until the next, rotating endgame comes back. So I do think that this will be really good for Honkai Star Rail. Hopefully they will implement it. Then for the last topic of the video I want to talk about, it is Castorice. Now, this is pretty risky to talk about as a content creator, because talking about any content that is unofficial, it could come with some consequences to the video, even the channel. But I think that with how many waves this topic has been making in the Honkai Star Rail community, I feel like it is something we have to talk about. And once we all come to an understanding, we need to make sure our voices are heard for this, because there is a bit of nuance to the way that this whole Castorice situation is. So I'm not going to go into any very specific details about Castorice, but there is a mechanic that she's going to have, which will provide an effect to characters on your account. Now, I say account because this effect, the condition for it to be active is not only for Castorice to, she doesn't have to just be on your team. All you need is Castorice to be on your account in general. And that's going to give you the ability to have this effect active in any fight with any characters used. And that's, a pretty crazy thing to think about. It's a global passive for the account. And while this current one that is, unconfirmed for Castorice, but people are talking about, while I personally think it's not super strong on its own, I think we have to also think about the precedent it'll set for future releases. Because as we all know from Hoyoverse, we just finished talking about Powercreep a bit ago, they love to give characters more and more things. So while this current global passive isn't that strong, in my opinion at least, what's to stop them from giving more of these global passives that will give even more? Like if you start giving stat buffs, if you start, heavily increasing damage from these passives, that is something that could make characters into must pulls, even for people who don't plan on using them, which is going to make Honkai Star Rail's gacha system extremely predatory, even more predatory than it already is. Because let's be real, it's a gacha game, it's going to be predatory. So all in all, when it comes to this, I think that if this specific global passive makes it into the game as still a global passive and not just a when the character is on the team kind of passive, while I think that might not be the final straw for me, if we are right in the fact that it creates a precedent for them to add more of these kind of passives that are better, and they do that, then it might really be over for Honkai Star Rail. But we're going to cross that bridge when we get there. Well, when we get there for Castorice's release, but if we get there for this kind of thing destroying the game. So I just want to conclude here. I think that Honkai Star Rail can definitely bounce back from all this. I think that they have a lot of potential, especially since with what we saw from the Amphoria story stuff, they have listened to us more, which is such a good thing to see. But we need to make sure that they are continually hearing our feedback, continually hearing all these issues that we're having, and really just us making sure that we're being heard. So being vocal through stuff like surveys, making videos like this, posting on socials is always a good thing. And at the end of the day, we just have to hope that the company actually respects what we say and will listen to our suggestions. But with that, we can really only hope that they'll do the right thing moving forward for all these things, honestly, to make the game better for both newer players and also players who have been here for a while. So that's it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this, I really do appreciate it. I kind of just wanted to give all my thoughts here. If you enjoyed it and want to see more both Honkai Star Rail and Zenless Zone Zero content from me, be sure to hit that subscribe button. The support is greatly appreciated, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you have anything else that you'd want to hear my opinion on. But with that, I will see you all next time.